Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
So, Wendy, you remember college, right?
I sure do.
Okay, so that
Wasn't that long ago.
No, not quite that long ago. So we're not ancient yet. But what was your favorite urban legend or story about the University of Wisconsin?
Probably the legend of Tunnel Bob.
Tunnel Bob.
Lived in the steam tunnels beneath the city, and people would, report stories of seeing him lurking around and stuff like that.
Actually, one time I took an adventure into the steam tunnels underneath the city because they had left a manhole open.
Oh, man.
And so went in through the manhole, into the tunnels, and saw a sleeping bag in the steam tunnels because it was like
so somebody was
February.
living down there.
Somebody was living down there. Also saw a half-eaten rat.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if that person had eaten the rat, but it was by the sleeping
Because it
bag.
could have been another rat.
Any kind of animal.
Yeah.
Manhole was open, so a bigger animal could have gotten in and eaten the rat.
Yeah.
But I'd like to think it was Tunnel Bob who was mowing down on
that's
rats.
sad if he has to eat rats.
No, actually, Tunnel Bob has been revealed. He's a real guy. He just likes going down the steam tunnels.
And actually, recently, I did a Google search, and I found a story. Someone had gone down and interviewed him and stuff like that. So
Yeah, he just is a guy that loves the steam tunnels. So he's not some, he's not a chud, a cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller.
But we didn't know that when we were in college. So
No.
he was a very, mysterious entity that...
Well, with YouTube and the internet, I mean, everything really
Yeah.
has changed. Like information. With Snopes. Even Snopes.
Oh, it ruins all the fun.
Right. Remember the urban legend that if your roommate killed himself, that you would get A's for the rest of the semester?
Oh, yeah,
or
that's right.
whatever?
You just automatically pass your classes.
Yeah, so I was always doing it whatever I could to make my roommate sad.
Oh,
I was always like, you're not a good person.
That's terrible,
Your parents
Mike.
don't love you.
No.
Hey, it never worked, though, so I never got straight A's in college. That was the only way I was going to get a 4.0
Wow.
in college.
Well, I haven't heard any legends about where we are currently, but I imagine we're so close to Disneyland
That's right.
because we're in Anaheim, California right now.
We're in Anaheim for the NAMM show, which is the National Association of Music Merchants. And so it's all different. It's all like instruments and cool speakers and PAs. And I haven't seen anything besides a haunted piano. I did see a haunted piano.
Sweet.
It is kind of a haunted piano, though, because it's playing somebody's last performance. It was recorded.
Yeah.
And then it's even how far they move their fingers.
Yeah, that's
and stuff
cool.
Like that.
That's neat.
The MIDI can capture that, and then the piano plays itself. So that is pretty sweet. And we're right next to Disneyland. I could see Walt's frozen body from here.
I saw Mickey peeking over the wall.
He was looking at us.
We did see some ukuleles that were alien head ukuleles and
Yes.
some skulls. Lots of skulls, of course.
Right.
So there's some fun little weirdness there. But mostly it's just been rock and roll and lots and lots of guitars.
Yeah.
Lots of people playing. You walk into the conference hall and it's just a cacophony of sound.
It is. It's funny. So everybody that's here works at a music store, works for a music manufacturer or something like that, or is in a band. So imagine walking in a Guitar Center, if you ever have, and you'll hear one or two people just playing some Randy Rhoads guitar solo or whatever. Now imagine walking into 1,000 music stores at the same time and everybody's playing guitar.
Yeah.
It's kind of how it sounds.
It's a conference hall that's the size of, several football fields.
Easily.
And it's just filled with every instrument imaginable. And I mean that. And they're all being played simultaneously, not in concert.
Right.
So it's intense.
I've not quite seen I haven't seen a virtual tuba yet. I haven't seen a MIDI.
Virtual?
I haven't seen a MIDI tuba.
Okay. So not every instrument.
That's about the only thing I haven't seen. But otherwise, anything you can imagine.
Yeah.
People are creating it to make music with. And so we've been checking that out the past few days and playing too. And having fun playing music, playing our paranormal songs to the podcast for these weirdos out here.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who came out on Thursday night. And we're getting ready for another show tonight, actually, in Los Angeles. So.
That's right. So we're talking to you on Sunday,
Yes.
January 28th. And, we always complain about the weather. Today we are staring at palm trees and
Yeah,
it's
it's
75
beautiful.
degrees. So we cannot complain today. And
We shall not
anybody
complain.
who we meet tonight that is listening to the podcast for the first time today, it was lovely to meet you.
There we go. You're speaking in the future from the future?
Yeah, my past is speaking to my future.
All right. Well, we got a little time travel then here.
That's right. So anyway, it was a great time. It was a great time
The
meeting
show was
you.
a huge success.
So
Oh my
unbelievable.
gosh. Incredible.
Okay. Anyway, we've been having a great time in California, and I had a lot of fun interviewing Matthew Swayne again.
Oh, yay.
Who did the Haunted Rock and Roll book. We interviewed him for
Right.
one of our first 20 or 30 podcasts,
Very-
back in 2015, early 2015.
Right. And very appropriate for the weekend of all this rock and roll music
Yes.
we're surrounded by.
And so he also wrote a book on haunted colleges. And since school's back in session and the kids are back, skipping class, causing trouble and mayhem at the universities across America, we thought, what a perfect time to talk about haunted universities. And so that's what we talk about with Matthew Swayne, and he's got some really interesting things to say. So let's go to the tape.
Joining us for a second time is author Matthew Swayne. The last time we talked to Matt, we were talking about haunted rock and roll. But I tell you, since we just saw the students come back to the University of Wisconsin here in Madison, I was thinking about when I was at UW and how we'd like to talk about ghost stories and everything like that in the wintertime when there was nothing to do when we came back for the second semester of the year. So Matt also wrote a book called Haunted Colleges, and we wanted to get some of his favorite ghost stories from different colleges across the United States. Matt, thank you for coming back. How you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I'm doing great.
All right. Well, the last time we talked to you was about haunted rock and roll. When did you get into, checking out haunted colleges, or what made you interested in finding the ghost stories of different universities?
So unfortunately, that's a long story because it goes back to my birth. I was born on Halloween.
Okay.
So what happened was when I was working as a newspaper reporter for the Daily Herald, it's a small paper in central Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I'm born on Halloween, so I get a lot of the Halloween stories that come up. And trust me, I love Halloween. I usually refer to it as the season of Matt. And
Great. Wait, it's your birthday.
yeah, it is my birthday. So I was always looking for a good Halloween feature story. And so one year I decided to do ghost stories around that area. Any type of folklore, ghost lore that I could find, urban legends. I was going to write an 800, 1,000-word feature story about that. But what happened was I got about halfway into it and I realized I didn't have enough material. So at that point, I was a former Penn State student, so I remembered there were ghost stories on the Penn State campus. So I started researching, started to talk to people, and I found a whole bunch of stories about the ghost stories of Penn State. And for some reason, and of course now we sort of know because of all the interest in the paranormal and the supernatural, after I wrote that feature story, people stopped me on the streets. They talked to me in bars, wherever I was. They were telling me their ghost stories, and they were telling me how much they loved that story. So that always, kind of sat in the back of my head as a writer, as someone who wants to, I wanted to write books. So I always thought that seems like a really good, interesting story to do, ghost stories of universities. So this was back in the internet, before the internet era, where I would wait around for every October for the student newspapers and the newspapers in the universities, in those university towns, to start writing about their ghost stories. And I would collect them. And I'm kind of a info pack rat. I just am always collecting stories and articles. So that's really how I got into writing about the universities, the haunted universities. But I got to say, the whole time that I was writing these, initially I'm writing these books like I just want to write something interesting and compelling. But I found it fascinating for one really big reason, and that's I always consider people go to colleges and universities to become more rational, to lose the superstition, to take up science, and yet I would almost guarantee you that acre for acre, universities and university campuses are probably more haunted, have more ghost stories than battlefields or castles or anything like that. That's what always intrigued me. That's why I kept going with this. And I started out actually writing about Penn State ghost stories. I self-published a book on that. I self-published a book on the ghost stories at the University of Pittsburgh, kept it in Pennsylvania. And then Llewellyn wanted a bigger book, so I wrote America's Haunted Universities. So that's kind of a long-winded answer of how I got there.
Well, that's perfect, though. I mean, what I liked is when you said you were talking about the pre-internet days.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is cool there is that you're talking about how, before you could just look online for something, you had to really wait until Halloween came around or go into like an archive, especially the student paper. And I still find that. So I just wrote a haunted tour of the University of Wisconsin last year.
Okay.
And going into finding the stories and finding everything, if you want to get an archive, you can find the archive of a Madison newspaper. You can find an archive of a Milwaukee newspaper. You can find I can find an archive of a Waukesha newspaper, small town, like a small city in Wisconsin, back to 1850. But if I want to find the stuff of the student newspaper back past 2005 or 2006, you still got to go to the place.
Right. Right.
You still got to go there, and you still got to find like those individual kind of news stories and look into, and especially Halloween's when it all takes off. So, what would you say that was the first time that you found a story that you're like, oh man, I can totally make a book out of this? Do you remember that particular story where like you had that moment like, no, I can turn this into something really cool? Do you remember what that story was?
I do, and it's actually from Penn State. There was, and this is one of those ghost stories that's based on an actual historic fact. But in the library on Penn State, Petit Library, there was a murder in the book. There's the students all refer to the area as stacks, and it's just row after row. It's a maze of bookshelves that just goes 100, 200 yards. It's really amazing. And there was an actual murder in those stacks. And then after that incident, there were reports of people feeling like a cold breeze on their neck. There was actually someone who saw an apparition there, and I read that one and I thought there's something there to it. And there was another right down the mall from Petit. There's a theater called Schwab Auditorium, and Schwab Auditorium has at least 3 ghosts. And this is where it got interesting for me, because I approached this as a journalist, as what I consider an open-minded skeptic.
Sure.
That's how I approached this. And what I found there was usually when I was investigating those first couple stories, I would actually try to find people who witnessed it. And what I found more often than not was, well, when my friend went there, his brother's roommate said that you would get these classic urban legend type things.
Right.
But at Schwab Auditorium, what I found was that there were people going to the press with their own stories. These were firsthand accounts. So there, to me, as a writer, as someone who, I like to write feature stories, there's that narrative tension that gets in the reader. Well, and I go through it too. When I'm writing this, I might start out as a skeptic, then I become somewhat of a believer, then I, don't know which way to go. And I think that's what really drives those stories, and that's what I found so fascinating about those two in particular, that I thought there's enough material here, there definitely was enough material, and that the material was interesting enough that I thought I could, get a publisher interested.
Interesting you're talking about a murder that happened in the stacks. In the in Penn State. So when exactly did that occur? Do you know like the era or the decade or the year?
Yeah, it was 1969, I believe, over Thanksgiving break, and it was devastating for Penn State and for the Penn State community, and I can just imagine the parents too having to relive that all the time. So it was a real thing, and there were 2 or 3 murders on campus, but that was the one that really stuck out for that.
That's interesting because in Wisconsin too, we had an attack in our memorial library here. We had an axe attack in the early 80s.
Wow.
There was no premeditation. I mean, there was no kind of it was like a really like a random crazy person axe attack to a poor girl who was working in what we call the stacks.
Yeah.
And so, we had the same kind of thing. And around the late 60s and early 70s, there were several murders like unsolved. We don't know if they're crimes of passion or anything like that. Several like murders at the University of Wisconsin that just like, of course, nobody ever talks about, right? But just like very mysterious things in that era. And some of the haunted activity that we have around here, or stories like you said, I think the open-minded skeptic's the best way to look at it, because if you're like, oh yeah, there's ghosts, then the next question is, well, prove it, buddy. I'm like, okay,
yeah.
That's how we started with. So you try to remain on the here's what people have seen, here's what I know kind of thing. And so was that murder that you guys had there, was that solved at least, and that person eventually faced justice?
Well, that's the really interesting part about this story. So embedded in this ghost story is a legend that says that the student will remain in the stacks until her murder was solved, and it never was solved. But about 5, maybe 10 years ago, I guess he would be an amateur detective, wrote a book about the case in which he puts out a possible suspect for it. And since then, the library, I can tell you, has been pretty quiet. And I've checked every single year for stories. So it was never solved, but a few people have kind of speculated who the killer was. And, there were rumors going around that it was Ted Bundy, because Ted Bundy's dad taught at a nearby university, Bucknell. But, I tried to check that, and the timelines don't really match up.
Sure. Well, of course, and Ted Bundy makes everything salacious. Like associating anything with the major serial killer like that. And that's the kind of thing that, goes through college campuses. And that's the kind of legend, like, that urban legend that there'll be an email chain that said, oh, somebody saw in Maury Povich, a psychic, that said on Halloween this year, there'll be a murder at a Big Ten university.
Right. Well, that story also made me think about why these stories seem to be so quote unquote sticky. Why, the ghost stories in the University of Wisconsin, and I know the ghost stories in Penn State can go back a century. So why do they stick around? And that became interesting for me. And there are, as you go through the ghost lore of various universities, you come up with a lot of themes. And as you point out with the University of Wisconsin and with Penn State, with a lot of other ones, there's this idea of suicides and murders crop up quite a bit. And my theory is now that I look at those stories as cautionary tales. And, no matter what anyone says about universities, they're actually very safe areas. When you have a student body of 80,000 people and you have one homicide in how many years, that's extremely safe. So what I think is people keep telling these stories because they almost serve as a warning sign when the paper isn't full of homicides and it isn't full of crime. They kind of serve as a way for students to let other students know, that these dangers do exist, not to lull yourself into complacency. There's a whole different level to some of these stories that I just find pretty fascinating.
I think that really that's an excellent point. And, Madison here, we're absolutely spoiled with safety. I'd say. I remember, so I went to school in the mid-1990s, so 95 to 99. And I used to work at the student newspaper, the Badger Herald. Or we had two student newspapers, and I was working, the Badger Herald was one of them. And so I remember in 1990, this must have been in the beginning of 1996 or at the beginning of the fall semester in 1996. Somebody, we celebrated a year without any homicides in Madison. So there are no murders for an entire year, right?
Right.
The next day, a student gets killed execution style.
Oh my gosh.
Like on the main drag, like over a drug deal gone bad or something like that. And not even, so not even some kind of sketchy thing. This is he gets absolutely executed. And
Right.
you could feel, I'd say that the tension on campus for the next week or two or whatever, like everybody was shaken by the fact that we had just celebrated how safe this place. Hey, how safe is everything? And then
Yeah.
this isn't just this is an execution happens like the next day. And
Right.
and so I think your point there, where you're saying that not only these ghost stories serve as things that like spook us and scare us, and they're also reminders that even though like we shouldn't get into a false sense of security on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, there was another case probably in I want to say the late 80s. We had a sniper on campus who shot and killed another student. And yet I could not find any evidence of a ghost story there. And so, again, I start thinking, why do we tell one ghost story? And why, if these are all just, kind of made up by the student body spontaneously, why are there two stories and only one creates ghost stories? And the idea I came up with there is that this sniper thing was so bizarre, so outrageous, that there's no way really to conceptualize a warning for that. It's just not going to happen. Whereas the story about the murder in the stacks embeds this idea of, okay, don't go out alone, that's all kind of pushed into that story.
I think that's a great point, and that's something that we don't think about or talk about too much, is the kind of events that seem to generate more ghost stories than others. Like a sniper attack is, that's almost like a terrorist event. And, a terror event does not, you don't hear the same ghost stories after a terror event, even if more people die or whatever, that you do hear about like a crime of passion or a murder or like in Chicago, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and things like that. Like, so gangland violence, that breeds ghost stories. Gangland violence breeds ghost stories, while certain kind of things seem almost, I don't know if they're taboo for ghost stories. Like, so, I mean, think about the event that just happened in Las Vegas. That horrible tragedy, that guy shooting up a concert. That's the kind of thing where it almost seems like if somebody said that they saw a ghost or heard phantom gunshots or whatever, like even in a couple of years, you wouldn't just be like, too soon. You'd also be like, there's a real kind of discomfort attached with, I think, these kind of horrific events, rather than events that we can kind of wrap our head around. Like you said, don't go to the don't go out in the middle of the night. Don't get involved with criminals. There can be a warning associated with those ghost stories that random acts of violence don't seem to have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And with universities, you have an added complexity in that I consider it a transitory population. You have a class coming in every semester and a class graduating every semester. So these ghost stories serve as almost, in my opinion, a kind of community building. And the community is going to be built very carefully, and you're not going to go outside of the norms of that. The story simply won't stick unless they get everyone's buy-in. That's kind of how I see it. Penn State, Wisconsin is not unusual in the number of, I think actually the Big Ten schools tend to be a little more haunted than other ones.
Okay.
But I do notice that it almost seemed like as I was writing this book, there was a template to some of these stories, right? Okay. That all the universities did have the cautionary tales. If you look at, and they also had history stories that I thought were almost like history lessons. In Penn State, there's the ghost of Old Coley, the mule that haunts the campus. But in Notre Dame, you have the story of the Gipper, who died tragically, win one for the Gipper. But he supposedly haunts, I think it's Washington Hall there. And there was one story that says he's riding a horse through campus. There's all kinds of interesting stories like that. And I think what that does is that gives the ability for the students to tell those stories, even if it's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of ghost story. they still are creating this sense of community. Everyone has the inside joke. Everyone learns a little bit about the history of the university, and you can embed that history lesson in about 2 minutes, telling that story.
Like, so the Gipper was a football player, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was a great football player, and he under the coaching of Newt Rockne, or was Newt Rockne I'm not completely familiar with the Notre Dame story. I saw Newt Rockne All-American or whatever.
Yeah.
When I was like
Newt
10.
Newt, I think, was the coach who used that story to motivate the team.
And famously, they made a movie of it. And this was football, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea was that at Notre Dame, like, it's part of the great Notre Dame Fighting Irish tradition. And, the great coach like Newt Rockne and one of his best players, the Gipper, tragically dies. And then he uses the win one for the Gipper as a way to get everybody around the team motivated to win the big game. And then the movie, the Gipper, is played by Ronald Reagan, who eventually, so that's why, they used to derisively call him the Gipper as president, I guess.
Yeah.
But that whole, I just wanted to explain that to the people who may not have heard it. But that's a great way to put it too, because, okay, so the Gipper rides a majestic horse through Washington Hall at Notre Dame. So that in that ghost story, encompasses the majesty of the Notre Dame football program, the history of the university. It instills pride in the person listening and telling the story, that kind of thing. So, wait, you said there was Muley at Penn State?
Oh, there's Old Coley.
Okay, Old Coley.
He was literally the first employee of Penn State, and at that point it was called the Farm School. And they brought Old Coley to take limestone from a little quarry at the edge of campus up to the site where Old Main Building is now. And also Old Coley would work out on the fields with the Penn State students. Early on, Penn State students would work at the school's farm, and sometimes the university would loan out their students to surrounding farms. So Old Coley worked there, and what he became is the first mascot. I've always teased everyone that Penn State could be the Penn State Jackasses, not the Nittany Lions. But I mentioned that in front of a guy who owned a mule farm, and then he told me the difference between a mule and a jackass. So that joke doesn't land as well.
Fair enough. Wait, real quick, what is the difference between a mule and a jackass, just so I know?
Oh, so I think a mule is a horse and a donkey. They crossbreed those two. So it's sterile. I think that's it. And then a jackass is just a donkey.
Oh, just a donkey? Okay.
Yeah,
Fair
I
enough.
think that's how it works. But we can verify that later. Maybe.
I think you're right.
So after Old Coley died, they preserved the skeleton. And then throughout, every time they would move this skeleton around campus, these ghost stories would start. At one point, Old Coley was in Watts Hall, and the students said they could hear, the braying of a mule and hoof print, or the sound of hooves coming down the hall. And then some other times that people actually said they saw this ghost. I go to work very early on campus. I'm never afraid of walking into the ghost of a mule. But
Right.
what I think this story really does is, it took me about a minute and 30 seconds to tell you that story, but you get a little idea of the history, how old the university is. You get a little idea about how blue collar, hardworking, this idea of service is really important to Penn State students. And so that kind of gets embedded in that story, this idea of these students working on the school farm, going out to other farmers. All those things are subtly embedded in that little story. So, there are a lot of people, when I say that I write these stories about ghost stories at university, they think it's kind of funny, but I have come to really appreciate those. We can debate back and forth whether these ghost stories are real or not, and I have some ideas on that too. But I've learned to really appreciate these things as almost like this grassroots type of community building, storytelling.
I like the way you're putting that there too, in that the lore around a college, around a university, becomes part of its, it really does become part of the history, and it makes people feel attached to it. It makes people feel some kind of connection to each other, a bond to each other as they're sharing this experience. Because, the whole thing, people who are alumni of something are always very like, oh, you're an alumni. They have that they have that shared connection. And I think it's not only because they shared like maybe the same professors or maybe the same classes or maybe they stayed in the same dorm 10 or 15 years apart.
Yeah.
But there's also a shared mythology that goes along with this. As I've been working on ghost tours throughout Wisconsin and Minnesota, in Waukesha, we have Carroll College that has, a couple of buildings there,
Right.
where everybody, they tell haunted stories. In Minnesota, there's a haunted bridge at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis that has, it's always urban legends about ghosts of suicides and stuff like that.
Yep.
And, those kind of things really do create the kind of mythology that connects people, because you can make it's like you can make a joke with that person about that ghost story or about the, what happens after a touchdown at the football game or, things like that. And so these ghost stories are just an extra layer of connection and history among the university. And I like that. And I'm thinking about so you had to research, probably a ton of universities and colleges when you were working on your book. I'm interested in a couple of the stories that you heard that you were like either taken aback by or that seemed to break that kind of, shared history mold that you were just like, oh, that's a weird one. Which ones took you aback?
Well, I will tell you, and again, this is the one from Penn State, and this one took me aback because, again, I at this point, as I was writing this, I really look at it as folklore, and I didn't give much, as much as I want to be an open-minded skeptic, I saw this as more folklore and sort of a mythology. But there's a building on campus at the Penn State campus, which is, I think, the oldest standing building on the campus, called Old Botany. And when I wrote about Old Botany for my first book on Penn State ghost stories and for America's Haunted Universities, it to me just was cut from the ghost lore cloth. And there's across the street from Old Botany is George Atherton, who was a president of Penn State. His grave's there. And so, if I was going to consult universities on how not to have a haunted campus, I would warn them not to have a grave on campus, because that's just bait for this stuff. But there's an urban legend that Old Botany is haunted by George Atherton's wife, and the urban legend states that she was buried in the attic, and it's just a crazy story, but they got spread, and I debunked it, and a bunch of other people debunked it. But what happened was, after I wrote this book, and this is usually what happens after you write the book, then you get the really good stories. But
right. You're like, oh, come on, you couldn't have been a couple months before my deadline.
Exactly. So this was a few months after the book was out. I had a friend say, my friend read your book, he has to talk to you. So I met this guy, and he was a former custodian. He had retired from Penn State as a custodian. And he told me, because I basically said, well, Old Botany is just kind of these are just urban legends. And he told me some stories that went beyond the pale of a normal type of folklore, ghost lore type of thing, because it was a personal first-person account. At one point, he was vacuuming one of the halls, and it's a pretty small building. And just as he finished, he turned the vacuum cleaner off. He heard this tremendous crash, and he said he could hear glass breaking, shattering, and he figured someone broke in. And so he ran down the hall to the noise, and he said as soon as he opened up the door, and he could still hear this kind of clamor behind the door. As soon as he opened the door, suddenly it just stopped, and it was just an office. There was no glass around. There was no, he said it sounded like beakers and test tubes breaking. So it was just a regular office. Well, then I looked into it, and I'm pretty sure that area that he was telling me about was a place where they had labs and lab equipment way back in the day. So, and I don't know whether he would have known that information or not, but he told me he was so freaked out by the kind of activity there that he asked to get put on another building to clean another building, because he said it was nearly constant. So here's a case where that makes me, step back and try as a writer to make sure you're putting everything on the table for people. You're not just approaching the material as a joke or community building, but there are people that have experiences, and you have to be honest and you have to respect that, because this guy was clearly moved by whatever happened to him there. Now, could it have been natural explanations? Could it have been,
right?
There's a lot of, I'm not just immediately saying it's true, but I'm saying there's this phenomena that happens to people and they believe it. And he was one of these people that kind of, he was an honest guy and convinced me that he definitely experienced something, maybe a lot of things in that area.
How many you think of the, when you were interviewing and talking to people about the story, and like you said, when you were working on the book, you were trying to get first-person experiences, if you could, right? And that's always a trick, is to try to get first-person experiences, because that's always a better story than when somebody, says like, well, I heard this happened, and you're like, okay, well, anything can happen. So, about how many of the things in your book do you think you were able to get stuff from people who actually, had an experience like that guy you were talking about, that you're like, oh man, he was so affected by what happened to him. He's like, yeah, I'd like to work somewhere else, please.
Right. I would say, and this is just a figure off the top of my head, I hate when people say, well, 8 out of 10, they just kind of pull that out. But I would say there's probably about 20% of the stories that I have in there are people who have actual encounters, not just stories of people having encounters, but especially what I try to do is use either people that would talk to me or people that would talk to the press, because I think there's a real ridicule factor that people are afraid of, that if you go to the press, I think that gives me a little bit of idea, first of all, who it is, and then the honesty involved. But I remember a story in, I think it was University of Maryland, and I can't remember the name of the building, but this woman said that she had always been a skeptic, and that she experienced, at one point, I think she heard music playing, and from what I understand, the phenomena that she experienced in that place was exactly what the ghost lore was about. But she, did everything to debunk it. She couldn't, and she actually fled the building, as I recall. So, and then she, when she reported this to the press, she basically said, I used to be a skeptic and I'm not anymore. I think that's pretty powerful stuff when someone has experienced something that they're now completely opposite of the view they had. I mean, it doesn't work in politics that often.
No, right. But, when it changes somebody into a believer, obviously, there's something to it, because it's affected their lives in a huge way. And if they're willing to talk and share, I think that's the problem with anything that's anonymous. They're like, well, I'm afraid to tell people because I think I'm crazy. It's like, yes, but it's the fact that you're willing to tell people that helps us believe it. When you're making extraordinary claims, somebody's got to stand behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're thinking about the ghost stories and stuff, like you said, you felt like the Big Ten campuses might be more haunted than some of the other places.
I do.
Did you find certain kind of ghost stories in certain places versus, so some schools or some kind, like state schools might have different kinds of stories than community colleges might have different kinds of stories than big name private universities. Did you find any trends as the type of school to the type of story?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up, because one of the things I found a couple different things. One of the things I found is there's a regional difference to some of the stories. Now, they might, believe it or not, I found small campuses had just as many ghost stories, just as interesting ghost stories, and a lot of different kinds of ghost stories. They were pretty much the same. Like if I pulled them out, you wouldn't be able to tell me, well, this one is at Ohio State and this one is at, Juniata College near where I live. So there wasn't that much difference there. But what I did find was that, for instance, in the Midwest, there are a lot of stories which I think are really stories to embed in a type of behavior in a student. I think they're almost like morality tales. And the one story, and I'm going to try to remember, I think it was in Iowa State or the University of Iowa. There was a building where the legend had it that there were three female roommates. And over the week, they all went out on dates and they were all madly in love with their boyfriend until on this Saturday, they find out that they've been dating the same guy. So they go up to the top floor and they throw themselves out. Okay, it's a story. And so these three students or these three ghosts will return and visit when roommates are having squabbles or disagreeing. And they'll appear anytime there are arguments between friends or roommates. Now that to me has a very Midwestern vibe to it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was hoping that the ghost of the guy that got to date all three of the girls, like he comes to the men at Ohio State and teaches them. He's like, if you say the right incantation, he'll come and teach you his ways.
Yeah. The guy somehow got off lickety split on this one. But so that has a really a Midwestern vibe to it. But then, and I think this one is in Strong Hall, University of Tennessee. You're probably going to get a lot of angry alumni because I'm messing up these stories.
Okay, good. That means the alumni are listening. That's
all that matters.
Come and get it.
But this one is the ghost appears to the female students if they're guilty of unladylike behavior. And so that to me has a very, kind of Southern Gothic idea to it or attitude around it. So there are all these different regions that seem to have ghost stories that reflect the norms and the culture of those regions and what they adhere to. So I noticed that. The other reason I think that the Big Ten has a lot more ghost stories or, seems to be more prolific in these ghost stories is because those universities arose pretty much right after the Civil War when spiritualism was pretty big. Mm-hmm. So I think that may have given people a reason to retain those stories. That's just a theory.
That's absolutely right, though, because Lincoln had his, was it land grant? I mean, there was a certain thing that so on the University of Wisconsin campus, we got Bascom Hill, Bascom Hill is where the university is. And so we have a big statue of Abe Lincoln. And the reason it's a big statue of Abe Lincoln is because it was because of his specific, like a land grant to the states for of creation of universities. And I'll let you finish.
Yeah, that's the land grant universities. The one thing that I couldn't find a lot of is I couldn't find a lot of ghost stories as I moved west, where I guess the universities there would be quote unquote younger. So that made me think that maybe it had something to do with the era those universities were founded. And once you build a tradition of ghost stories and you build this idea that it's okay to tell a ghost story, then these ghost stories, kind of pile up. And so the other thing you notice is that over time, the ghost stories change and somewhat reflect the era. So in the early, let's say the late 1800s, early 1900s, very traditional ghost stories, suicide victims coming back to counsel, feuding, roommates and things like that. But then over time in Penn State and some of the other schools, they're like ghosts of axe murderers. And that ghost story might reflect some of the slasher movies. At Penn State, there was a poltergeist outbreak in one of the dorms. And that was a really interesting story for me because I remember the story when I was in school, which, was probably late 80s, I remember the story of this poltergeist outbreak. So I went through the records of the Collegian, which is the paper, the student paper here, trying to find, there was a story that, as I recall, the RA was in her room and the bed started to breathe in and out. She heard weird noises. Then the room kind of went crazy. The television came on and off, all the classical poltergeist entity movie type stuff, and she ran out into the hall. So I went back to try to find the original story because I could have sworn they quoted her, but I couldn't even find it. So I'm wondering whether I didn't, fill in that information over time too. But what I think now is that story really reflects the movies of the era, and you'll see that too with urban legends.
Exactly right. I think, I don't know if we were talking about this either before the recording or after we started, but, we mentioned the whole idea that there's that chain letter that goes around every year about, around Halloween that says, and you can find this on Snopes.com or whatever, but that says that some psychic on Maury Povich or Geraldo Rivera or whatever is the popular talk show of the day.
Yeah, Gene Dixon when I was there.
Right, Gene Dixon. And, then it was probably Miss Cleo in the year 2000.
Yeah.
But, so a psychic predicted that there will be a string of murders on a Big Ten campus
right.
on Halloween this year. And if you know how people party on Halloween, number one, that satisfies the be careful when you go out part of the urban legend, the watch out. But also the idea of the serial killer. The idea of the mass murderer, ghost stories, I think, when you get in the 1800s and the early 1900s, don't seem to be of the mass murderer variety. So when you talk about the stories reflecting the time and the fascination with spiritualism that would happen when these stories were developed, in the late 1860s, 1870s, that kind of era, I never had thought of it that, maybe that's one of the reasons because when I looked at newspaper reports from Madison and they had weird ghost stories in the 1880s, there'd be stories of, weird white phantoms roaming the dorms.
Right.
And then there would be some people in the school would stay up late. There'd be posses hunting for these phantoms and things like that. I can't imagine that today. The idea that they'd be like, oh, we saw a phantom in the hall, so we're gonna have people stay up. And today it would have to be something much more related to a current scare, something that would affect people modernly.
We had a phantom clown on campus 2 or 3 years ago. And the campus literally went crazy. But, I think that's related to this whole clown fear and it and all of those things that are, in the mass consciousness.
So that's funny that you guys had a clown panic on campus.
Yeah.
Because, they had, I think in Tennessee, when somebody reported a clown, they closed a school down for the day.
We didn't get that lucky, but
yeah, because somebody said that they saw that, and then people started playing into it too. People started dressing up like clowns and waiting up in the street, and they were shooting a movie in Green Bay, Wisconsin, called Giggles the Clown or something like that. They were shooting a horror movie, and so people were calling the police, reporting to see this killer clown in the street, and it's because they were shooting a movie.
Yeah.
So it really does relate to the fears at the time, and obviously it became one of the biggest horror, or the biggest horror movie of all time, at least box office wise, cashing in on that whole mad clown craze. So I wonder what the next one will be.
Yeah, hard to predict.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so winding down, last couple of things. When you were doing research for this particular book, what was the most outlandish story you think you heard when you were working on something, or you looked in the paper and you're like, I can't even believe this made the paper? Or was there something in there that either was too crazy to put in the book, or you're like, I gotta put this in there because nobody's gonna believe that this made the paper?
There was one story, and I can't remember where it came from. I think it might have been I should just blame it on Ohio State. You're from Wisconsin. I'm from Penn State. Let's just blame it on Ohio
I
State.
am happy to blame it on Ohio State.
But there was a story about a ghost that was shaped like a penguin. And I remember I couldn't find anything out about it. So I usually try to have 2 or 3 sources that kind of cross-verify it, right? And this one was just so weird that I had to put it in. And to this day, I still debate, is this a case of, and I'm sure it's happened to me more than once, but a case of what I think they call fake lore, that someone writes this just so that someone else picks it up as a real story or a real piece of ghost lore or a real piece of folklore. But this was, I think, in a fraternity house, which should have been a red flag right there. But the students said that they would hear this walking up and down the hall, and it sounded like flippers. And then there was this report of this ghost that looked like a penguin. So that was almost too crazy to pass up. And it did have elements of it. There's a ghost story at Penn State about a woman who was the RA, and they could hear the squeak of her shoes, even though she died long ago. But I think that, again, was them making fun of the current RA. That's what I take from that. So that the Penguin Man was probably the weirdest one I put in the book.
Okay, no, that's an interesting one. I'll keep my eye out for Penguin Man. Next time I head out the Ohio direction. And I think, one final question. We're talking about these stories and kind of talking about what connects them. And sometimes I find when I'm researching certain things or looking at old newspaper articles, there are things that freak me out a little bit, or freak me out to the point where I'm like, I don't want to read that story again. Or I almost don't want to retype it, or find a way to put it into new words or research it anymore, because I find it too disturbing. Or I'm just like, oh, that's gross. I don't want to talk about it. I had that happen in Minneapolis. There was a certain story, and I'm gonna give people a spoiler if they take the Minneapolis Ghost Walk from a mill disaster they had in Minneapolis, and where some people would see a ghost of a tornado of flesh, like a vortex of flesh spinning around, with eyeballs and bones and like body parts and stuff. And people,
that is awesome.
People reported seeing this weird spinning vortex of flesh after the mill explosion. And just like trying to write about it and think about it kind of weirded me out. So when you were working on your book, what's something that might have weirded you out or creeped you out to the point where you're like, okay, this is making me uncomfortable. Like, this is scaring the storyteller.
So, first of all, full disclosure, I get creeped out pretty easily.
Fair enough.
But the one that sticks out to me is actually at Ohio University. And Ohio University is dubbed pretty much the most haunted campus in the United States. They usually get number 1, and Penn State's usually around number 2.
Okay.
But as I recall the story, and again, I could consult for these universities. Don't buy a building that was an insane asylum. I would stay away from that. But Ohio University did buy a building and renovated it, and I think it's Wilson Hall. And if I'm remembering the story right, when it was a mental health facility, there was a woman who got lost, quote unquote, and I'm sure by calling it a mental health facility, I'm being very generous back in the day.
Right.
And
a torture chamber for people who were mentally ill.
Apparently, she was found in a room. She had locked herself in a room and starved in that room and died. And so on that room, and I forget what room number it is, there is a etching. There looks like a shadow of a person that they can't get the stain out. It is in the shape of probably a young female. So writing that really creeped me out, because I think it was based on something that happened, and it certainly sounded like something that could happen.
No, I can see can see where that would bother you a bit. I mean, plus because it turns the tragedy of mental illness and the the way that we used to take care of mentally ill patients and stuff like that before we were able to figure it out. It turns it into like a weird cautionary tale, or it exploits the fact that somebody was sick enough to starve themselves, and then now it becomes like a scary monster story.
Right. And what you find a lot of times is with these stories, there are other variations, and the other variation is that she committed suicide. But the part of the story that seems to go throughout those is this idea that there's a stain on the floor that you can't get out, and they've tried to get it out, and they tried to paint over it, and it just keeps on returning. All
right. Matthew, I really enjoyed talking about haunted colleges today, and your research is great. If you guys check out the show notes, you're going to be able to find a link directly to Matthew's book where you can pick up a copy for yourself. Now, what have you been working on lately, Matt? Is there a follow-up to haunted colleges or haunted rock and roll, or anything else in coming out for the season of Matt?
Yeah, I'm actually going to try to put out self-publish a more haunted rock and roll. I absolutely loved writing that, and I found a lot more material, so I'm going to do that sort of on my own. And then in the fall, just in time for season of Matt, everyone, I'm going to have a book out on haunted World War II.
Oh, awesome. All right. Well, when you're getting ready to put that out, make sure you give us a call so we can talk about it on the air.
Oh, I'd love to. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. Well, thanks again to Matthew. And once again, you can find links to his books and stuff like that at our show notes, and that's othersidepodcast.com. It's going to be /181. Now, another thing you can find there, Wendy, is we have a song, and this week we're picking an older Sunspot song, but it's a college-related song. It's about having a crush on your TA, and I think this must be autobiographical because Wendy's like, I got a crush on my TA. I've got a song for everybody.
Who didn't have a crush on a TA at some point in college? Come on.
Oh, you're absolutely right. All right, you got me. Now, okay. So this particular video that we filmed for this song was in a couple of different locations at the University of Wisconsin. Number one, we filmed part of it in the Humanities Building. And
spooky.
But the Humanities Building always had an urban legend that the architect of the Humanities Building, that they had built the building backwards.
Yeah, that's right.
They built it backwards, and he was so upset about it that he killed himself, and that his ghost haunts the building. But that's not true at all. Like, he didn't kill himself. Yeah,
good.
No, he I think he may not be still alive, or he just recently passed away. But he lived to a ripe old age and designed buildings all over the country.
Cool.
He also designed like several of the buildings in Washington D.C. for the federal government. So that urban legend was not true, and it's not haunted by him, at least.
Yeah.
Second, we also shot on Bascom Hill, right next to Abe Lincoln. There's a big statue of Abe Lincoln, and there's 2 bodies buried on Bascom Hill.
And we didn't know that at the time of recording the video, so
but
maybe we should recheck that footage.
Right. See, we do have like probably an hour footage of us like rolling around Abe Lincoln, and so there's 2 bodies buried on Bascom Hill, and they were 2 of the first settlers of the Madison area, 2 of the first European settlers of the Madison area, and there's even little stones that say their initials.
Wow.
Up there. So
possibly haunted.
Well, there is a haunted story of it. Actually, I found a haunted story of it from like somebody. It was a foreign, like it had to be translated, but somebody from like Korea came over to visit their sister who was going to the University of Wisconsin, and she reported a ghost sighting on Bascom Hill, and then went back to Korea and like put it in her blog.
Wow.
Yeah, she said that she saw like a weird face staring at her from behind Abe Lincoln.
So that's got to be one of the stories on the UW-Madison haunted tour.
There's a
right?
UW-Madison haunted tour. And
haunted walking tour.
And that will start up again. If you like haunted college stories and want to learn more about the University of Wisconsin, you can check that out once the weather starts getting nicer in Wisconsin. That's going to be in April, and that'll be at MadisonGhostWalks.com. But without further ado, here's the track, Sunspot with More Than My Degree.
1, 2, 3, 4. I know you're my TA, but this is more than math. And there's a certain number I'd like to discuss after class. I'm not nervous about this test, or that problem set. A passing grade in this dumb class is not what I hope to get. Was it just coincidence that you count on me? Do you know I want you more than my degree? You don't like it is. I think that you're really great and want to have your kids. Was it just coincidence that you called on me? Do you know I want you? Do you know I want you? The things that you explain, what do they mean? I don't care, just keep on looking at me. Just keep on looking at me. All the others in our class don't seem to get it. They wanna learn, and I want extra credit. I'm not nervous about this test. All that problem said, passing grade and missed on pass is not what I hope to get. Was it just coincidence that you called on me? Do you know I want you more than my degree? Every time you say isosceles, it sounds so dirty. Age won't matter when I'm 26 and you're 30. Do you know I want you? Do you know I need you? Do you know I got to have you more than my degree? More than my degree. More than my degree. More than my degree. Oh yeah.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Before we sign off, though, we got to give a shout out to our man, Dr. Ned.
Ned. Oh, I bet he would love Nam so much.
Yeah, he'd go crazy because I know he's a massive music fan,
Yeah.
especially Beatles and Rolling Stones. And there's tons of like candid photos of the Beatles and Rolling
Yeah,
Stones here.
they have
that
a lot
people
of-
taking artwork and things.
A lot of memorabilia. There's some of these booths are like museums.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, something we didn't talk about before. We did see. So people who listen to See Another Side podcast probably love the Misfits. Because they sing songs about paranormal themes and horror movies.
Yeah.
And, yeah, we saw Doyle all dressed up from the Misfits yesterday, and he was hanging out with his Devil Lock. And, man, he's got to be in his 60s, and he looks great. I mean, under the white makeup, you can't tell, but he's like still buff and everything.
Yeah.
Like that. I'm just saying, if I'm in my 60s and I have arms like that, I will be a very pleased man.
Keep working out.
Keep working out, everybody. Anyway, thank you very much, Ned, for your support.
Thanks, Ned.
He's at the Patreon level where he gets a shout out in every single episode. And we'd like to also thank our entire Patreon community
Yes.
of awesome people for helping keep See You on the Other Side podcast doing songs
Wonderful people.
and stories and things like that every single week. So thank you very much for being awesome. If you're interested in being awesome too, you're not a Patreon member yet, and you would like to be a cool person, a better person, and a good human, check out othersidepodcast.com/donate, where you can achieve Patreon immortality with See You on the Other Side.
See you back in Wisconsin.
Laters. Wendy.
Mike.